On this episode of Engage, we are joined by Jeff Chang and JJ Sweetser from the Rotation Construction Committee to discuss pairings, the optimizer, and how you end up with that 32-hour Montego Bay layover instead of back-to-back 11-hour Green Bays in the middle of February. Here's your host, Jason Depew.
Welcome back to the Engage podcast. I'm Jason Depew. Today we have the Rotation Construction Committee. I have Jeffrey Chang, JJ Sweetser, joining us to talk about everything rotation construction and the optimizer. Welcome, everybody.
Hello.
Great to have you here. So for all the new Delta pilots, since we've been hiring almost 2,500 a year, what is Rotation Construction Committee? What does it do for us?
We take the monthly requests from pilots, we take that across the street, and we go to Delta, and every month we build our schedules. Basically all our pairings, all our rotations get put through the optimizer, and that's what you see in your bid packet every month. One of the big things that we do is we're the advocates for the Delta Pilot Group. One of the things that we ask from the pilots is we kind of need to know what the pilot wants. So in the past, what we have done was you might have noticed the surveys coming out from the polling phone numbers, but those kind of got stale. By the time we got that information and by the time we were able to translate that, it was stale information. Guys would leave the category and go to another category. So it was not quite up to date. So one of the things that we have now is the rotation preference system, and it's a live system that is on the Delta Alpha website. And what you could do is you go in and you put in your preferences for what you want. And that is customized for each of our Delta pilots. So it knows when you log in with your login ID, it has your seat, it has your base, and it knows what equipment you're on. And based off of that, you answer a few questions, and at the bottom you can put in some comments, and we take that every month and we get the information. Based off of that, we walk that across the street to the crew planners, and that is what our basis for our request every month. So one of the things about the comments is we do read every single one of those comments. We try and act on as many as we can, and we share comments with the company and let them know what everybody is looking at right now. It's important to know that your comments are completely anonymous. We do not know who wrote what. However, some of the comments do go across the street verbatim. Please, some of the colorful language on there should be kept at a minimum. So we work about 2 months ahead. So we work in conjunction with network. So the way the process works is every month, the network sends flight operations the plan for 2 months out. And the plan is ever changing, as you guys may or may not be aware. So that comes out 3 or 4 times a week. And every week there's slight changes, a little bit of updates to the network schedule. And the crew planners kind of go through that and come up with, we call it 4 runs, okay. Right? So there's 4 runs in a month. And so there's 4 mock bid packages, if you will, that comes out. And we take a look at those and we try and see where we can make some tweaks for quality of life improvement for our pilots. And again, all of that is based off of the Delta pilot's inputs.
So this sounds very involved. Like you're actually over there physically with them and they're running through this 4 times and you get to give input each time?
So we're there at during the last run of the month. And then prior to that, we send emails back and forth. They send us the runs and we take a look at that with the help of all volunteers in each of your bases. In each of the base in your fleet, we do have a volunteer. They are really the eyes and ears for us because we can't, with an airline so large, we can't be everywhere. We really rely heavily on them to tell us what the base sentiment is. And we take that information and we try and advocate for that base and that fleet. So if you're a Los Angeles pilot, you fill out your RPS and you talk to one of your fleet representatives there, they get that information for us. And when we send out the monthly wish list, if you will, to the fleet chairs, they come back to us and say, this is what we're really looking at in Los Angeles for this month coming up. And when we get that information, that's really what we push for. So we say, Los Angeles is looking for this, New York is looking for something else, Atlanta is looking for this. So we really try and advocate for all the bases. Not saying that we always get it.
Sure.
There are some limitations. There are a lot of limitations, mainly with staffing and with credit is a function of cost. So each time that we ask for something, there's a cost associated with that. And basically, we could create the perfect rotation for everybody every time, but it would cost so much money that we wouldn't be able to run a business.
Sure. So how do they balance that? How do
Um,
they respond to you, or how do they express to you the cost of a given ask? And then how much wiggle room do we have there?
so every month there is there is a percentage of credit that the company is willing to go up to. And after the company has their initiatives that they are trying to run every month, and we do actually have a pretty good relationship with them now. Once we get the cost kind of back from them, we find out what the wiggle room is. And based off of the priorities from RPS, that's what we kind of go after. If you notice on the bottom of the survey, we ask you to rank your priorities from one
Uh-huh.
through four. We take those top four priorities, and that is the one that we go after for your base and for your airplane. For example, some of the things you might see on there that we get a lot is trip
Yeah.
mix, right? So people are asking for, they say the trip mix is the most important to me. I want a lot of 1 day trips. And so 1 day trips, just so everybody knows, is probably one of the most cost prohibitive for us or staffing prohibitive for us because it does require more staffing for us to do more 1 day trips. Just because of how our PWA is structured, it does require us to have, the break in duty and all that, all those other things that eventually stack up. The optimizer likes to create longer trips, 5 day trips, but as pilots, we don't necessarily so many of them. And with our new PWA, some of our narrow body fleets do have restrictions on that. So that has been helpful because prior to the new PWA, you would see a huge increase. It would be a preponderance of longer 5 day trips that would come out. So when we get these requests and we see that trip mix is the highest request or whatever, and we do have some wiggle room, we'll go in and we'll try and get the ratio of trip mix that was asked for.
Okay.
And if we can't get that, we'll try and get close. We'll try and get it up to our credit limit that we're allotted for that month. And also, if it doesn't hit that credit mix, it might be a staffing limitation,
Sure.
right? And the staffing limitation isn't we don't have enough pilots or it's a lot of it is based off of the PWA staffing formula. So there is, the 1 year and the 3 year look back. And based off of that, there is a lot of, we need this X many amount of reserves in a category that gets us to a point where, okay, we cannot do anything else because there needs to be so many regular line holders and so many reserve pilots in that category. So we'll try and get it up right up to the limit every time. And so that document to us is very important. So getting Delta pilots to participate in RPS is very important. So after we kind of get to that point, they'll send us a final bid packet per se, and we review that. And once that gets reviewed, that's what is loaded.
I fly to New York, and different pilots want different things. I'd rather have a long trip because I commute in via air. I know a lot of pilots live downtown, so they want a 1 day Caribbean turn because it's high credit. I think in any base, you're going to get a lot of different requests. How do you balance that when you get your RPS results? How do you conglomerate it all together and get something that everybody wants?
That's a great question. So one of the things about rotation construction is that there is no such thing as the perfect trip,
Sure.
right? If we ask 17,000 pilots what their favorite trip is, we'd get probably 17,000 different answers. So this is our attempt to kind of answer that question. And what we try to do is to try and get a mix of all of those things that you just asked for. We try to get that percentage and kind of distribute that amongst what our guys are asking for. And so say 18% of people want 1 day trips and 20% want 3 day trips or whatever the case may be. We'll try and get to those numbers. And once we get close to those numbers, then it'll be a variable of your seniority to kind of go to PBS and bid those and get those. We try to distribute that as evenly as possible based off of our pilots' preferences.
Awesome. You talked about trying to take things to the limit of what the company is willing to give us every time. We look at our 1 year and 3 year look backs, and we're taking the things to the absolute limit on staffing so that we get the most efficient, best trips for us. How about that percentage that we can go over their plan? How much wiggle room does that really give us? How successful are we in getting what we want with that little percentage there?
Well, I'll say over the last year, the last 8 months or so, we've been very successful with the crew planners. They've been willing to work with us. And whereas before they would try to do it, and then we were really concerned about the operation, post COVID and all that. But now they are engaged with us. They actually do take our opinions, and they do listen to what the Delta pilots want. One of the examples I can give is you'll see a couple of months ago that we've tried to increase rest after red eye.
Good.
And we've been pretty successful at that, some months more than others. And you can see that by increasing rest after red eyes, it really did improve the overall reliability of the rotations. So one of the metrics that we look at, that the company looks at, is rotations flown as constructed. And so if we can build quality, reliable rotations that everybody wants, the company's happy, and we try to get the Delta pilots happy as well. So some of the other stuff that you see out there is a part of network, and we can't control that because that's just the way we're scheduled. And so because of how we are scheduled to depart, there's really no way to change some of the schedules out there. You might see a flight out there that is, you're doing a red eye, and then the next day you have to go do another red eye. They call those rockets, right? But that's just part of how that is scheduled. And there really is no way to try and avoid those without cost prohibitive layover. To lay over a crew that long and then have them come back, that crew's kind of out of the system for a long time. They end up building those types of trips like that. Those extreme examples, they're now, in that example, we don't have too many of those. And those get closely monitored because of the types of trips that are built.
It seems like that's a little bit of a fragile trip. If a crew's doing 2 red eyes in a row and they can't get good sleep on either one, I would imagine it's a high threat for fatigue calls, and that would impact the company, and that would be another way that they realize that may not be the most effective scheduling tool.
That's correct. So that's one of the things that we try to mitigate as well, is to see what are the weak points in the construction of the rotation so that we can try and alleviate some of those things so that it does not break, right? So the rotations don't break, crews don't fatigue out, and that sort of thing.
I've heard a couple other examples of potential successes from the rotation preference system. I don't know if you have any to share, but I have a friend, he lives in kind of a major secondary market, and he put in his rotation preference survey one time. Can we get 30-hour layovers in my hometown? If we do, I promise I will bid for every one. And lo and behold, a couple of bid packages later, there were a bunch of 30-hour layovers, and he got to bid for a bunch of them. Do you have any other examples like that? Is that really the RPS driving that?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, we do read each and every one of those comments. And I'll give you an example of something that went awry. So we have a category that was asking for a longer layover in Asia. And because they did that, we were like, okay, this is what the category wants. We'll try and get a longer layover in Asia for this international category. So we went in, we did get the longer layover. So it went from a 24-hour to a 48-hour layover. And then the emails started pouring in. And because it ended up being the same amount of pay, but longer layover. So the pilots in the category wanted the 4-day trip, but be gone for 3 days, essentially. And so I said, well, this is what was in RPS, and that's what we went with. And we saw a dramatic jump in participation from that category, and we were able to move it back to what it was before. So it's good and bad, right? So it's a double-edged sword. So we want to caution everybody that really, when you put in your request and you put in your comments, make sure that is really what you want, because we will go and advocate for you guys, and we will, we might be able to get that stuff, right? If it isn't what you want, please let us know, because we really want to change that so that it is what everybody wants. And on that note, RPS, right now, we're about at 35% participation, and we're trying to get the word out. It's in the MEC news every month. And on that note, if you want to know what your results are in RPS, it is published in a lot of places. So we have it published on the ALPA website under the Rotation Construction Committee page. We have it published in the MEC news, it's in there, as well as in your AeroDocs. So in AeroDocs, if you go to the Alpha folder, you'll find a rotation construction subfolder in there, and all of the previous month's results are there. So if you want to know what your category is asking and what the results are, we try to be completely transparent, and it's all out there for you to see.
That's a great resource to have, even in the jet flying related material in AeroDocs. And I love to hear the effectiveness of the RPS as a tool. We requested something, we got it, we decided we didn't like it, so we requested something else and we got it changed back. It feels like as a line pilot, a lot of the time we don't have a whole lot of input into trip construction or scheduling, but it seems like some pretty good effects that we're getting from this RPS. That's really awesome.
Yes, and the company is actually really interested in the results every month as well. We send the results to the company because they actually, popular to contrary belief, they actually do want pilots to kind of have what they want because of, like we said, they want the rotations flown. They don't like to reroute. They don't like trip breakage. And so the happier they can make us, the more reliable these trips become. Everybody benefits from that. So we want to make sure that what everybody is asking for gets noted and gets heard. That's the important thing.
Well, you heard it there, folks. Your voice is heard by the company, and you can see some of the effects it has. That's really nice. Jeff, you mentioned that at the bottom of the RPS, there is a space to put comments, and it's just free response, a big giant text box. You can put whatever you want in there. I can see how the language in there could be productive or turn people off to our desires. What are some good examples of things to put in that free response box?
Thank you for that. That's a great question. A lot of the comments that are constructive as far as getting things changed, that is really what we're looking for, because there's a lot of comments. If you tell us about a trip or a specific trip that you had, sometimes that's not as constructive, because what we do with those comments is we have to apply it to the whole, right? So when we do the construction, we look at the entire fleet. So it's hard to kind of drill down into a particular trip, but we look for trends. How can we change certain things? So we don't like 4 legs after a red eye, for example, that we can kind of go in and say, on a global level, we need to change this type of thing. So that is really where it makes the most sense,
Sure.
right? JJ will talk here a little bit about the optimizer here in a few minutes, but if we can understand that the comments that we get back, it's hard for us to go in and change individual trips. Just the way the nature of the optimizer works, there are going to be some really good trips and there are going to be some duds in there. And one of the things that everybody needs to understand is some of those duds, no matter how many runs we do, there's always going to be duds in there. And that's just because of the optimizer has to put together this big puzzle, and we try to get more good things than bad. So that is our ultimate goal, is to end up with more goodness than badness.
Sure, there's always going to be those parts and pieces left over they have to cobble together. I've been junior, I've flown those trips, and a lot of the time you can look at it in advance and see this trip has a low likelihood of completing as planned. I'll do my best, but it's up to Delta to make that happen and realize their mistakes and fix it later. So I'm happy to leave that to them.
Correct.
That's really great. Let's talk about how to get to the rotation preference system. I updated mine this morning in preparation for the podcast episode here. How do people get to it?
Well, so you just go to dal.alpa.org.
Okay.
And then down in the middle of the screen, once you log in, you'll see an icon for the rotation preference system. Once you click on that, it'll open up another tab, and you can go ahead and update your information. Once you hit submit, that all goes to the back end, and there's some math done to collate all that information, but it's a live survey. And once you get in there, you can update it as many times as you want. And one thing to note is that if you ever leave a category, your information gets wiped, meaning all your preferences get deleted and you'd have to re-input that. For example, even if you change bases and you're on the same equipment, you're going from Atlanta to New York, for example. And once you've converted and you've gone to New York, all your Atlanta preferences gets deleted and you'd have a blank slate for New York. And we ask that you refill that out so that we get the most current update for your new base. It's also the same case when you change seats. So even if you're on the same equipment, same base, but you upgraded from the right seat to the left, again, the same thing will happen. And we'd ask that you re-update your preferences so we can get that new data for
Great.
everyone.
So any big changes career-wise, go update that RPS. And it's nice to know that you can update your own preferences as often as you want. I have different bidding strategies for the busy summer period versus the holidays versus the slower shoulder months. So as you anticipate those changes coming up, you can change your requests, change what you want for that time of year. And it sounds like we continue to get good results from putting in those inputs.
Correct. And we pull that information once a month at the beginning of the month. So if you go in, you can change it 3 or 4 times, but the only change we will see is the snapshot at the beginning of the month when we pull the report down. If you put something in right now and you don't think you change your mind later on, you decide you're not a commuter anymore, you can go back and change it from you're a commuter to not a commuter. And we won't see that until we pull the snapshot in time. So it's a live survey. We can go in at any time, fill out, everything changes, but it is the snapshot pool that we grab at the beginning of the month that is what we use, and it is what ends up in that we publish to everybody else.
Great. Well, I'm not going to move to New York this month, but we'll keep that in mind. Your last change before the end of the month is what gets seen by the RCC and put into the company. Jeff, what else do we need to know about the rotation preference system or the RCC from your standpoint?
Well, I think one of the things that people have a lot of questions about is the optimizer. I have JJ Sweetser here. He's one of our vice chairs on the committee, and he has had experience in the past working with the optimizer at a different airline. So one of the things that everybody needs to know is that the optimizer isn't new. It is not a Delta-only type of software. A lot of other carriers out there uses it, and we're fortunate enough to have JJ here with us on the committee, who has had past experience. So he's been very vital in helping us navigate what to change in the box. So I'll turn the mic here over to him and let him speak on that.
Excellent. JJ, welcome. Right. What can you tell us about the optimizer? Just give us a down and dirty. What is optimizer?
The optimizer is basically just a big calculator. So it takes all of the rules from the FARs, PWA, and on all those things. And then the company can do is apply different cost penalties to different rules. So for example, if you remember back right when the PWA came out on the 717, we used to have a lot of 30-hour layovers, right? And so all of a sudden we had the min calendar day, and the company decided that we wanted to not have 30-hour layovers where we're paying people just to sit. So they raised the penalty on those, and subsequently the 30-hour layovers went away. And we started deadheading crews all over the place because that's just organically what happens whenever you remove a 30-hour layover. Somebody has to deadhead in and somebody has to deadhead out. So with that, they decided, well, now we're taking seats out of inventory because now we're deadheading crews all over the place. So a month or two later, the 30-hour layovers started to come back, and they've kind of stayed. And you will see some of those disappear on months that are more tightly staffed because laying those pilots over for 30 hours removes them effectively from the system. So deadheading in those scenarios effectively removes credit because it makes those pilots more productive, which we don't necessarily like, but that's kind of what the optimizer does. So that's all it is it's just a big calculator. And you'll see some months where, especially shoulder months where we have excess staffing, the trips just automatically get better because they can add more credit because we have more pilots. But, summer months, for example, there's a multiplier for credit. So if it's a tightly staffed month, they can raise that multiplier, and the optimizer goes and says, oh, well, there's a multiplier on this credit. I need to remove as much credit as possible because the penalty gets excessive. So when they do that, then you'll start to see just ugliness in the rotations, basically. That's all it is. It's just a big calculator, and the company inputs their staffing numbers into it, and it does what it does based on whatever penalties they have set and buffers and all those other things.
What are some of the levers they can pull on that calculator to try to manipulate things? What are the big items that they're looking at?
The big item for them is staffing. It just is staffing. They've got obviously a staffing model. They have all the pilots. They have all the vacation, training, sick, all that's accounted for in there. And then Jeff spoke to the PWA reserves required, and that's all in there. And so basically all they do is they do some math and they come up with, for example, like New York 320, they can handle, based on the number of pilots that are there, it can handle 10,000 hours, for example. So they'll put 1,000 hours in there and then they'll run that and they see what the results are. And it's kind of like almost like playing a game of whack-a-mole, because you start to see different things pop up based on some parameter that you thought was going to help and it didn't help. You take that solution that finished up, you look at it, and then you make some changes and rerun it. And so you're kind of it's really just a game of whack-a-mole all month that they play, where something spikes that they didn't think was going to. So, I mean, there's a bunch of different things they can do. They can manipulate like rest. So for example, last month on the 737, we asked for a minimum of 13 hours after a 4-leg day, and they had the staffing to do that. So we were able to do that. Some months when it's more tightly staffed, they aren't able to do that just because it drives. The 30-hour layover scenario we talked about is one of those levers that they can pull. They add buffers. They've got a new tool called calibration. They actually put a newsletter out about it last month, I think. And that is a tool that they can use to manipulate turn times and based on historical data and stuff like that. So that's another lever they can pull, because they can change the amount of impact that tool has on a solution. So there's a lot of stuff they can do. There's also a lot of stuff they can't do. Like we're starting to see in a co-terminal city, like I fly into San Francisco and I get in a limo and I drive over to San Jose. And then the next day I deadhead out. And what's happening with that is the optimizer is looking at it from a cost scenario where I land in San Francisco and it looks at San Francisco hotel, San Jose, and Oakland. And it says, oh, it's cheaper for you to lay over in San Jose. And even though I have to go sit in the car for an hour and a half to get to San Jose just to deadhead, where I could have just gone to San Francisco and laid over. It's just that's an optimizer thing where it's looking at a pure cost and doing things that maybe we don't want it to do. So we're addressing that. It's just tough because the PWA does allow it.
But that might be a good thing to put into your rotation preference system is, hey, on trips in general, if I fly into a city, sit in a cab or a limo for an hour or 2 hours, and then deadhead out of somewhere else, that's fatiguing and wastes layover time. Let's not do that. That might be a good way to get feedback back to them.
Yeah. And that's good data for us to have, because that's something we can physically hand to them and say, hey, this is the data we're getting from the pilot. It's not something we're just pulling out of thin air. That has a lot of weight behind it. They're very data driven, obviously. So it's huge help to have that.
So to all listeners out there, when that kind of stuff happens to you, please go in and update your RPS. And again, it's not, on this one specific trip, this happened to me, and make it generalizable. General situations that impact scheduling, flexibility, ability to go fly, and put that in there, and we'll get some feedback back to the company. JJ, you talked about playing whack-a-mole, and we've talked earlier, there's 4 big runs for the bid packages. My impression is they're running the optimizer a lot more than 4 times, right? They're running it many times every month, and they kind of...
Yeah, exactly. So they're running it basically nonstop. So once they get the first SIM file from network, the SIM file is basically all the flights that Delta has. Once they load that in, they start running that, and it runs, it doesn't run continuously because it does finish at some point. So they'll look at the final results from that solution and they relaunch it. So it's running all the time basically. But what Jeff was talking about is there's 4 SIM files basically that they get from network. You can really get into the weeds on that if you want.
No, don't need to. I just want to make sure that people know that we talk about tweaking things in the optimizer, and something spikes. They aren't just going to say, oh, well, there's that spike. We're going to send that to the RCC and see what they think. They're going to kind of try to get a good solution before they send it over to you.
Yeah, and there's maintenance has to touch it and all that. There's a lot of other departments that touch the SIM file before planning really gets a look at what the bid pack will actually look like, if that makes sense. Because they'll get a SIM file that has all the legs in it, but maintenance requirements aren't met. So they can run it and they can kind of see what it looks like. But then once the maintenance tail routing program is run, it reshuffles all of those flight legs, and that changes the way the optimizer builds the rotation. And then it applies rest and PWA requirements, all that other stuff to those. And then that's how it builds a trip. So once maintenance changes all that, it changes crew planning's whole outlook of what it's actually going to look like. So crew planning doesn't really know what polished bid pack's going to look like until probably about the 20th of the month or so, somewhere right in there.
When I hear about the optimizer, I'm a computer programmer by education. I feel like it should be able to get close to a set of kind of universal solutions, some rules that almost always work and almost always give the best results. If they're tweaking things all month, every month, are we getting any long-term good solutions from this optimizer, or is it just playing whack-a-mole all the time?
No, I mean, the crew planners have been at Delta for a really long time, and they've used the optimizer since, I can't remember,
2004.
2004. The optimizer's been around since then, so they're really good at it.
Way too good sometimes.
But that's to Jeff's point. That's where we've been able to kind of come in and say, hey, we understand what you're trying to do with this, but based on this data that we have from RPS, can we try this stuff? And as long as it fits their staffing model, they're willing to do it. That's kind of, I think, been the big problem is they know, or they think they know what we want, but from a crew planner, they don't see through the eyes of the pilot. So
I remember it was probably a couple of years ago now, but Bob Schmelzer from Crew Resources did a town hall or something, and his comment was, please bid in PBS for exactly the types of trips you want, and then I'll get your feedback, and then I can build what you want. And I felt like it was kind of an unrealistic request because those trips didn't exist. And I could put whatever I wanted into PBS. I want a pony and free beer on my layovers, but I'm not going to get it. But it sounds like the RPS is a much more effective solution than what he suggested. And it sounds like they're interested in getting that feedback from us.
That's correct. One of the things is we're trying to limit the backhanded water cooler talk or the rumors and those types of conversations. Instead, we're trying to hand them every month, unfiltered. This is what the Delta pilots actually want, and there's data to support that because there is an employee number behind each and every one of these requests that go in, and just because you're friends with someone, we're trying to limit that type of interaction because really that isn't fair to the rest of the pilot group, right? If you're living on the other side of the country, you don't have that access to come in to the office and give your opinion to the crew planners. And sometimes that gets too heavily weighted to the planner. When we're talking about levers, there are levers that they constantly use that do work, but a part of that is there are requests from people that go in, and if it's the wrong request, really they've done a lot of disservice because now it doesn't just affect them, it affects that entire category, right? So now the entire category is going to get affected because of a request that went in that may not necessarily reflect what the pilot group wants. And it's the same thing on the, not only on the pilot side, but on the company side, right? The drive-bys to the crew planners, and they're employees just like us. So we might come with a drive-by and they might test something and they might run it and it might work or it may not work. But really what it does is it takes away some of those resources that we're looking for because we can do other things with that would benefit more of our pilot group instead of one or two individuals. We were talking about we didn't want it to be unfair for the rest of the pilot group, based off of one or two requests that go in. And, we're trying to make this a more democratic process so that we can get the right mix for everybody. And once we get that mix, your seniority will kind of dictate what you can actually hold, right?
So the more people that participate, the better results we're going to get, the more it's going to represent the will of everybody in the category and not just the few people who responded to the survey. So the more of your friends you can get to fill out their RPS, the better results overall you're going to get.
Correct. And, in the past, the company has tried to kind of do a survey on their own. I don't know if you guys remember, they tried to data mine PBS in the past.
Yeah.
And they tried, to try and see what pilots were looking for. And I mean, that really just tells you that the company is interested in your opinion. They do want to know what you want. And the reason why we couldn't use the PBS was it's hard to kind of glean that kind of preferences from PBS itself, right? So
it is, yeah.
If you're trying to bid a trip on there, you don't know why I bid for trip 1, 2, 3, 4. Is it because of the layover location? Is it because of the commutability? Why did this person bid for this? Or is it because, Jason needed a day off on Wednesday?
Right. Or maybe it was just the least bad trip out of a bunch of bad trips. And that's what I picked.
Correct.
Absolutely. We hear a lot about, in general, you're saying Optimizer's been around for a long time, and we've covered this before in this podcast, but for the new pilots out there, why does it feel like the Optimizer has gotten more effective, maybe to our detriment lately?
Well, the Optimizer, like any other software out there, is a product of inputs, right? So when there was a initiative to do some cost savings or trying to see where they could have trimmed some fat, they can go in there and make these adjustments. And it's basically the things that are inputted that gives you, your particular output. And it really isn't a function of they just got better at it. That could be the case just because of the more time they have on the system. But a lot of it is probably a function of these are the inputs that we're putting in, and this is the result that we're getting. They are trying to get a certain level of results. And, a few years ago, there was that push to reduce credit. Yeah, I don't know if our listeners remember that, but that was not the first time the optimizer was used. We were using that prior to that. So it's basically human input, right? So I do not know exactly what they changed in the optimizer to do that, but
they removed a lot of their operational buffers. They went through, and I think what was happening was they were adding buffers on top of buffers on top of buffers, and our trips got really good as a result of that. And then at some point when they started to try to remove credit, those buffers were all stripped out of the optimizer. So now the optimizer says, all these rules are removed, and it's kind of a free for all, and it's going to find the most cost effective solution because those rules are all removed. So that's basically why the trips went downhill, to be quite honest. And
right away.
And we saw the results of that. And I know they did too. And then you bring in the pandemic and all those other things that made things kind of a mess. But I think now, to Jeff's point, in the last 8 months or so since we've been meeting with them on a monthly basis, you really started to see positive results. And not every trip is going to be perfect. I mean, it's a bell curve, right? So you've got some really good ones, bad ones, and everything. Hopefully the goodness is in the middle, but that's why all of a sudden the optimizer got basically more effective, was just because of the buffer removal.
Excellent. Is there anything else you guys want to mention about the optimizer or how we work within the confines of that system?
Just to follow up on Jeff's point just a little bit, when we send them our monthly requests, we basically ask for everything that comes out of RPS, and then they'll send us back some results based on that. And if it meets staffing, they're fine with going with it. And when it doesn't, we start drawing back on what we send them. So we basically look at what is ranked in RPS, and we start from the bottom and we start removing things until it fits that staffing puzzle. So that's kind of to follow up on your question. We do get every last bit of, credit that we can out of it. It's just not always our maximum ask. We have to bracket that, and we start reducing some of our requests just so we can fit in that staffing window. And once we do that, that's usually about where it ends up.
I'm not sure if I covered this, but the optimizer is not a new tool for Delta. There are things that are on there. And one of the other constraints that we do have is there are a lot of fingers or a lot of people in the kitchen, if you will. We are kind of the quality of life committee. There's other committees that have touch points with it as well. One of the things that is looked at is fatigue, right? So we have to balance how do we get the best quality of life and also balance some of the fatiguing trends that are out there. And so when we do some of those balances, it does affect how we can create some of the rotations. The other thing that is a constraint for us is the company does have initiatives. At the end of the day, we're here to make money for Delta, or Delta's here to make money for the betterment of all of us, right? They do put in initiatives that they do want to try. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, and one of the things that they found is, for example, during the holidays and during the high peak months, these longer trips don't really work that well. And so you'll see during high demand periods like Christmas and Thanksgiving, New Year's, they'll go down from 5-day trips. They'll limit days that touches those days to 3 days. So they'll put 3-day trips over those days, or they'll limit the number of 5-day trips that touches a holiday or a high demand period just to ensure operational reliability for that period. But all of that isn't free, right? So like anytime you do something like that, it does cost something. It does increase credit to a point. It does drive additional staffing for that period. So when we're bracketed in with those kind of constraints, obviously what has to give is some of our requests, right? So we have to take out some of the things that maybe a Delta pilot wants in order to satisfy that operational requirement. There are a lot of people touching this stuff. The crew planners they're just executing what is asked, right? There are a lot of other initiatives that the company has to try and improve the operation. They look at a lot of different metrics. You'll hear terms like returning time back into the system and things like that. And they do have new software that pre-optimizes the optimizer, for example. And what I mean by that, JJ kind of alluded to that, is they do have software that looks at historical rotations and how it's performed. And based off of that, they will try and make tweaks to that. And again, anytime they do something like that, it's not free. There is a little bit of cost to us, right? And by cost,
Sure.
it's either staffing or credit or the ability for us to do something. So those are the main costs. And I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that it isn't that we just, as much as we'd like to, we would love to go in there and make all this stuff and make it all perfect for everybody else. But we are living in a constrained resource kind of environment. And, we're trying to get that out there for everybody.
Excellent. Along with that, there's a related big picture discussion. As pilots are talking to the reps, giving inputs on what they're really interested in for our next contract, which is already going to start getting negotiated in a couple of years. I've always said that the Rotation Construction Committee needs a big set of sharp teeth in the contract. What are some suggestions? What can pilots advocate for with their reps that would make the RCC really effective for Delta pilots?
Well, one of the biggest things that we've been advocating for is the ability to manipulate the optimizer. Have an ALPA run, either in conjunction with the company or separate run, so that we can kind of see what is possible, right? So like if they can give us, these are the constraints of the month, or these are the parameters that you have to work within, and then we can kind of go in and come up with our own solution and present that and say, hey, this meets all of the things that you're looking for. And we wanted to play around with it. We've played around with a couple of things that we looked at, and we'd like to present this solution for a bid packet. And what do you think? And I think that's kind of the most versatile approach for us. A lot of the things that we have in the PWA is really a wall, right? So we try to block it from doing certain things that we don't like. But as JJ said earlier, it becomes a game of whack-a-mole, right? So some months you put some things in, and because there's a wall there, Wiggle has to find a solution around it, right? For example, when we look at trip mix and it says no more than 20% for 5-day trips or something like that. So now there's a limit there. Because there's a limit there, it does other things that we end up having to go back to fix. So I think for the RCC itself, if we can get in there and try different solutions ourselves, we might be able to present a better solution to the Delta pilots.
I think that sounds like a great idea. And I know that it's no longer unheard of in the industry. I know at least one of our competitors, there's a situation month by month where both sides, the company and the union, present a bid package. And as long as they're within a certain percentage of each other, they agree to take the union's bid package and use that one for the month.
That's correct.
If we could have that.
Yeah, that is correct. So there are other airlines out there that have a similar model. JetBlue and Alaska are two of the airlines but they have a much simpler model. We have 8 fleets. They only have 1. JetBlue has 2. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. It just becomes a much more complex puzzle when you introduce 1 or 2 and now 8 fleets, right? So now we have 8 fleets to contend with. So it does get a little bit more complicated in our model because we're so much bigger than those airlines. But the testing has shown that it works.
Sure. And we could get the company the same cost level they're looking for while getting Delta pilots more of what they want. That seems like potentially a good solution for us.
Yes, that's what we'd like to do. I don't know what the appetite is for us to try and get that, but right now, the way that we are kind of getting at it is the best way that we see so far, and it really is maintaining that relationship with the crew planners.
I'm pleased to add that after recording this episode, the MEC actually obtained some of the exact things we just discussed as part of settling MEC Grievance 23-05. This includes giving the RCC admin level access to the optimizer, allowing us pilots to recommend better ways to build rotations. This comes with 102 hours per month of company-paid flight pay loss for MEC volunteers, and it specifies clear consequences if the company publishes non-PWA compliant rotations in the bid package. This is one example of a process that the company and the MEC have been using to try to resolve grievances in a more efficient and mutually beneficial way, instead of an expensive process of presenting cases to an arbitrator who doesn't always rule in our favor. The company and the MEC have had success in mediated negotiations over individual grievances. You can read more about this particular grievance resolution and a couple others in Contract Awareness Bulletin 24-04. We'll include a link to that bulletin in the show's description for anyone with access to the Delta Alpha MEC website.
All right. That's it for today, folks. Rotation Construction Committee, please fill out your rotation preference system survey. This is your way to democratize trip construction, get your inputs to the company, and we have actual examples that show that your input is heard and will change trip construction, hopefully for you for the better.
You've been listening to the Engage podcast with your host, Jason Depew, produced and edited by Adam Yuhan and Brian Argenta. Remember to stay engaged.